I want to welcome our attendees today. Thank you so much for registering and participating in today's episode. For those of you that have not joined one of our previous conversations, as way of background, my name is Kelly O'Brien, and I lead both the Alliance for Regional Development, which is an organization that is focused on the Milwaukee, Chicagoland, Northwest Indiana corridor. The sister organization, which is 65 years old, is the Chicago Central Area Committee, CCAC. And back well over a month ago, when the world really changed, we wanted to understand how we could best communicate with our stakeholders and our members. And we kicked off these pandemic programming, insights and information for today and what's next. As we begin to transition into June, we do intend to rebrand this webinar series, and because it has been so successful, we hope that you will continue to watch, and please send me any suggestions that you have for topics or speakers, and we will do our best to accommodate those suggestions. Now, in terms of today, just so you note, usually you can find this across the bottom of the Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Please use that to send any questions that you would like for me to relay to our speakers. And the program today will allow me to introduce our speakers. They will then give opening remarks, and then we'll turn to questions. Chairman and Leanne, I will say I have already been receiving questions through my email, so I think we're going to have a very robust conversation today. Before we do get started, I want to remind everybody that our next program is going to be on Thursday. That is May the 21st at 1:30, so it's the same time slot. And I'm very excited to have a historian from DePaul University giving us insights into the 1918 pandemic and lessons we can learn from what happened then to apply not only for today, but information for what they call that second wave. Maybe we'll be spared, but knowledge is power. So please be sure to register for Thursday's program. So with that, let me start by giving a little background on the RTA. I know if you are not in the transportation world, it can seem very confusing. And Chairman and Leanne, if I say anything incorrect, please jump in and make sure that our audience is fully briefed. So my understanding is that the RTA board, and Leanne is the executive director, oversee the nation's second largest public transportation system, which serves more than 8 million residents in Cook, DuPage, Kane, Lake, McHenry, and Will counties. The authority is charged with regional financial oversight, funding and transit planning for the CTA, which is the Chicago Transit Authority, Metra, Pace Suburban Bus, and ADA Paratransit. The RTA manages a regional transit operating budget of approximately $3 billion, with assets of about $160 billion and more than $8.3 billion five-year capital program. Now, I will say that I have had the privilege of knowing Chairman Dillard for probably 20 years or more, and I have to admit I have a bias as a major member of his fan club, so I'm especially happy to have the chairman with us, and he has served as the chairman of the RTA since 2014 and was elected to his second term at this time last year, if I understand that correctly. And our executive director for the RTA, Leanne Redden, she joined the RTA after being the chief of planning for the Illinois Tollway and the director of planning for the village of Schaumburg. And she is the recipient of numerous awards, really recognizing her superior talents and a woman who moves the nation. So again, I am very honored to have both of you here today. And Chairman Dillard, would you like to kick things off with some opening remarks?
Sure, Kelly. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's so nice to actually be able to be sort of face-to-face without a mask on these days. And my wife thanks you for making me shave and shower and get cleaned up. And this is the first time I've had a sports coat on in a long time. these are strange times. I thank you so much for inviting Leanne and I to do this forum. Likewise, I'm a big fan of yours. I'm a big fan of what these two groups mean to our Midwest region and our Midwest economy. It's my second term or go around as the RTA board chair. I was a state senator in Illinois for a long time. I was a governor's chief of staff, and I can tell you I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. I'm speaking to you from my home office, and hopefully if I need my IT department, which is my college age or high school daughters, they're around. Let me begin by just talking about ridership and service for just a couple of seconds. The RTA, we work very closely, Leanne and the staff, with the CTA, Metra, and PACE. Those are our service boards to continue to provide service in these unprecedented times. Usually the RTA, just to give you a focus, provides 2 million rides a day. That is 1/6 of Illinois' population. It's a very different story now. We've seen an overall decrease of ridership of 79%. CTA rail ridership, the L as it's affectionately called, is down 88%, and bus ridership is down 68%. Metra ridership, the double-decker rail cars, is down 97% in ridership, and PACE, which is our suburban bus network, is off 71%. Each agency has adopted their own strict cleaning standards and is committed. It's their paramount, as safety is always their number one concern. They're committed to ridership, employee safety at these times. Throughout these three agencies, throughout this, all three of these agencies have encouraged essential travel only, and riderships practice social distancing, and riders, it's very strange to see, are wearing masks. Metra and PACE have adjusted their service due to the decrease in ridership. The CTA has not. It is running full speed. We know that Governor Cuomo in New York wanted the system in New York and the subways shut down for a number of hours a day. The CTA continues to run 24 hours a day. And we're one of the few transit agencies in regular times that runs 24 hours a day. Even London does not run 24 hours a day. The CTA and Mayor Lightfoot have kept service running on this full schedule, and people say, why are you running 24 hours? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, the more buses and trains that are running, the more room there is for riders to socially distance. That's very important. And then the CTA serves a wide range of riders. Chicago and Illinois is home to 1/3 of all the teaching hospitals in America, and we're very lucky, a system that moves many essential healthcare workers to numerous regional hospitals as well. The funding overview for operating and capital, I think, Kelly, is also important to understand, because we get hit with a triple whammy in the transit agency in Illinois. Let me remind you and the listeners on how we fund transit. It's important to understand. Leanne will go into this in more depth in just a little bit, but operations are funded about 40% from fare revenues, 40% from an RTA sales tax collection, and the other 20% is public funding. And there's a match that the state pays for regional transit, which is really based upon the amount of sales taxes that are collected. But you can see we have sort of a bummer of revenue sources. Obviously, sales taxes are way down, and ridership, as I said earlier, is just decimated. And we expect sales taxes to continue to decline. Capital funding, really important. 2 years ago, we passed a big statewide capital bill. We made our case for $30 billion in unfunded state of good repair, and the governor came through. That's before Governor Pritzker had to do a 2:30 press conference every day. And last summer, we passed Rebuild Illinois in Springfield, the largest capital bill ever passed in our state. a $45 billion infrastructure bill that had $33 billion for transportation, and the regional transit system got a lion's or a big share of that. The regional transit system has an $8 billion 5-year capital plan. That's nearly double the previous capital plan. But as you can imagine, I'm worried about the funding streams for Rebuild Illinois, which include a doubling of the state's gas tax. So sort of in recap, before the pandemic, the regional transportation agencies, we agreed on 5 principles for spending the Rebuild Illinois money in the annual pay-as-you-go funds and a 5-year capital borrowing program, which is part of that. And our 5 ways we really go about looking what we're going to fund are to begin decreasing that massive backlog of region-wide deferred projects, some $30 billion. We focus on spending projects or on projects that are completed in a timely manner. We want to provide near-term programming and program certainty. We, number 4, want to allow for long-term adaptability and transparency of future transportation priorities. And last, we want to continue to do things in a transparent, data-driven manner through an annual budget process that we have. So right now, we're trying to proceed with about half of the projects. That's about half of the funding from the Rebuild Illinois capital program. Just 3 quick examples are new CTA rail cars, new metro locomotives, and new PACE, which is a suburban bus system, bus on shoulder, like on 294, the Tri-State Tollway. We're riding those buses on the shoulders. So finally, we're in constant communication at the RTA with the governor's office. We provide updates to elected officials and to the governor on an ongoing basis. And nobody knows when this is going to end, but because of steps we've taken, we're in a better position than we would have been had this pandemic hit several years ago. So now I want to turn it over to Leanne, who will talk more about the financial impact of COVID-19 and anything else that anybody wants to know. Thanks again, Kelly, for having me.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. So Leanne, the Chairman gave us a lot of pretty startling data. How are you handling all of this?
Well, me personally and the RTA. So, I mean, these are really challenging times for all of us. And I think, the Chairman laid out some of that information. Like the Chairman, I am working from my home office. Our home office in our house is a premium since I have also 2 teenage boys and a husband. So we actually need 4 offices. So I'm in the makeshift office in the bedroom, and hopefully that my kids and my new favorite family friend, my dog, won't get too noisy in the background. So we'll try to get through this. But before any of us had heard of the COVID-19 terminology, the RTA actually was really set pretty well in terms of sort of a robust VPN network and the ability for us to work flexibly and even work remotely. So once the crisis hit and the governor shut down, we were able to really adjust without really very, very little interruption to our staff and our duties, and are actually performing all the duties that we would normally provide for both the service boards as well as for people with disabilities and people with their free ride permits, etc. So we were able to just pivot and continue those efforts in a remote work location. So we continue to work with communities across the 6-county region in our regional transit planning also. And over the next few weeks, we actually begin in earnest the 2021 Regional Transit Operating and Capital Budget Programming Planning with the 3 service boards. So, we continue to go ahead, full steam ahead. I think it's also our call centers, as I mentioned, are also able to really keep working for anybody who has questions or needs information about free ride programs or reduced fare passes. And as the Chairman said, the 3 service boards, CTA, Metro and PACE, have seen dramatic decreases in ridership as a result of the governor's stay-home order. Public transit, though, I think has really shown that it is an essential service for transporting healthcare workers, emergency workers, retail workers, and people to warehouse jobs throughout the entire region. So while, ridership has dropped off, we are really still providing some of those absolutely essential services. And now we're starting to also do some scenario planning and thinking about what recovery might look look like for both our riders and our employees. And I really want to thank, first of all, the service boards, though, and their leadership and their staff, especially the frontline workers, who've really stepped up and served the community throughout this pandemic. So I know the chairman gave you some stats and things like that. If you can indulge me, though, I'd like to give you a couple of sort of broader stats that I think are important to think about sort of the context of the transit system. So transit ridership had actually been declining a few percentage points year over year, even before the pandemic came and as people moved more to work from home. And we were seeing that effect of the sort of the ability of technology and people's ability to work from home already. Mobility options like Uber, Lyft, parking apps, Zipcar were making car travel even a little bit easier. So these were some of the other factors impacting transit ridership. And, you know, this helped us in some ways, though, because people could use some of these modes to get to and from buses or trains, or it might have meant that they could have staved off having to buy a car or a second car. So transit was still in sort of the portfolio of transportation options they used. But in other ways, some of those technologies and other services have worked against us, again, sort of accounting for some of the hit on some ridership that we'd already been experiencing. The RTA, though, has some pilot programs working with companies like Lyft and Via to, you know, just for this reason, to sort of think about how this changing mobility ecosystem is impacting us and how can we really become kind of find partnership opportunities, but really more importantly, I think, work to address sort of the changing rider habits of people moving around our region. And, you know, for years we've said that the current funding mechanisms also for our transit system just aren't sustainable. The chairman touched on the capital side of things, but, you know, we have a $30 billion capital need, but that's really just one part of it. The other side is the operating costs of the transit system. And they continue to rise just as regular costs for everything continue to rise, but we're impacted by that. So no one really could have ever prepared for a global pandemic and for this dramatic ridership loss that we've experienced of late. But this is very different to any recession that we can bounce back from. And like the rest of us and the rest of the economy, I think this will not be an easy recovery. So I think, though, I sort of, not to be doom and gloom all the time, you know, I think we're in a fairly good position from the perspective of we've been thinking about some of these issues. And we, a couple of years ago, put together our Invest in Transit strategic plan, and it has very clear goals for the next few years. And I think those goals still hold true. So mostly importantly, we've got to deliver value on the investment of the transit infrastructure that we already have. We need to build on the strengths of the whole network that we have across our region. And I think now is the time more than ever to sort of double down on some of those strengths. And we need to make sure that we're staying competitive. So looking critically and closely across the entire region as to what the services are and how do we evolve and grow and change and adapt in the future. So back to what the pandemic specifically means for transit and riders. First, there is the operating funding issue. Throughout March, the RTA and the service boards were working closely with the Illinois congressional delegation as Washington first began to sort of respond to the COVID-19 crisis. On March 27th, a $2 trillion funding bill called the CARES Act was signed into law. And that bill contained $25 billion of additional COVID-19 related funding for transit nationwide. And for us here in our region, that meant $1.4 billion in supplemental funding. So while that sounds like a lot of money, and it is, you know, it's very helpful for us, but really just sort of helping to plug some holes to keep the buses and trains running. So unlike traditional federal formula dollars, the CARES Act funding, though, is to remain available to all of us until it is fully expended. And the funding of the CARES Act can go towards reimbursement of operating costs to maintain service, as well as lost revenues due to the coronavirus. So the allocation for Northeastern Illinois across the funding principles that we kind of applied in thinking on how to allocate those dollars were really important for us, and our board approved this last year. And really what was guiding us was that the CARES Act funding at this time is really the only known supplemental operating funding available to transit to alleviate some of these longer term financial impacts of COVID-19. And I know some of you have probably heard about, you know, what the House passed last Friday, and potential another round of supplemental or relief funding. But I'm not one to count my chickens before they're hatched, as they say. So while I'm cautiously, you know, hopeful, you know, we can't count on additional dollars coming our way at this point. So we have to be fiscally prudent. The funding also of those dollars that have already been allocated to our region really need to be allocated in a data-driven approach. And we work very closely with the service boards to understand what those impacts were across the three of them. And funding and operation changes will likely be needed as we go further. And as I mentioned, as we begin the planning of 2021, because we know that the impacts of this crisis and the pandemic are going to stretch well beyond 2020. So the RTA and the service boards, we all work together on, as I said, sort of how are we going to allocate these dollars amongst the three operators. So first of all, it was really important that we look at the funding dollars, the 1.4 billion, and just to give you kind of a quick snapshot of how we've split those up, CTA, Metra, and PACE will be getting $817 million. Metra, $817 million, yes, that's correct. $479 million, and PACE will be getting $112 million. So I think it's really important for us to be sort of thinking about how those dollars are spent wisely. I think we, as the chairman said, we're continuing to work on how these allocations were spent across the region, as well as, more importantly, you know, that we can be accountable and transparent as we think about things going forward. My computer's frozen, so I don't know if that's impacting the video stream. Is it impacting?
No, I can see and hear you just fine. Thank you.
Okay, that's good.
And we're getting a lot of questions.
Okay, well, I can probably stop there if you like. As I mentioned, though, we are moving into some scenario planning. We are thinking about different ways to think about the future of transit. And, you know, we will continue to work with the board and our regional providers to really think through what the future might look like, and how we can make sure that the transit system is, you know, as important as ever and is here for the long haul as we look to try to rebuild the region's economy.
Great. We just had a visitor pass by, so we want to say hi to your son and appreciate the opportunity to have you join us. So as I mentioned, we are really getting quite a number of questions. So let's try to get through as many as we can. And one question, and you touched on this, Chairman, with your remarks, talking about the fact that you're continuing to run trains and transportation around the clock in an effort to have more options for people. But one question is, as people begin to return to work, how do you plan to provide for the spacing needed to commute on the trains?
Well, one way is we're available, and I mentioned the CTA continues to run all the time, so that we have more equipment available. So run the maximum amount of equipment we can efficiently do. I'm sure we're going to be working with employer groups as to perhaps the timing of when different businesses go to work, so that we can space out our very busy times, like maybe on the CTA Brown line. But we're going to be innovative. Leanne is very active nationally with the American Public Transportation Association. So we're going to be talking to our counterparts, not only in the United States, but throughout the, literally throughout the world, as we reinvent ourselves. The one thing, that I've learned in the 6 years or so that I've been involved in the mass transit space is we are always innovating. Nobody heard of ride sharing really before I began. So we're constantly in this transportation business of mass transportation, always molding and reinventing ourselves to give riderships and the people that depend on us, including employers, maximum safety and flexibility. So there's a number of ways we're going to do it.
Excellent. And when those changes are made, how will you best communicate that with riders?
We are active, constantly on social media. The CTA, the RTA, Metra, and PACE. I encourage everybody. If you're on this, you're probably technologically savvy. So hook up to our sites, as I would call it. So we're going to communicate through social media, through the regular newspaper, and electronic media sources. You'll have plenty of information that's out there. And as a plug to the RTA, you can always call our number or go to our website, and we'll direct you to a place where you can get the appropriate and accurate answer.
Thank you. So the next question reads, Class 1 freight rail lines use Metro lines and dispatch for the final miles into, out of, and through Chicago. On Monday, Progressive Rail reported that Metra is one of the 4 rail systems at risk for not meeting the December 31st deadline mandated by the Federal Railroad Administration for positive train control deployment. What steps is Metra taking to accelerate PTC, positive train control, activation on its system, and what are the implications to the freight and passenger operations around Chicago should Metra not be able to meet the deadline?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, I can get it. I've got the same answer you do, I think, Leanne. It's funny that the FRA and Progressive Rail used one of Metra's own sources of information to report that. Metra's fine. They're going to meet their deadlines, and Metra has actually been a real leader nationally in their quick implementation of a very expensive process, unfunded federal mandate of about $400 million. But Metra's been a leader. There's no problem, and it's because they're so aggressive with their own internal Metra deadlines. That's why that was even reported. But it was a Metra self-imposed implementation deadline. They're going to be fine. They're going to meet it with flying colors.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you. The next question, with the significant impact of COVID that it's had on public transportation revenues across the country, as well as traditional transportation funding sources, fuel tax declining, all of which you've mentioned, how important will innovative funding models / dynamic rider responsive routing play in RTA's strategy moving forward?
I'm not sure if I understand the question fully. Dynamic funding models, I guess I'm not really clear what the question's really kind of getting to, but I think, in the very short term, we've got to deal with the very immediate hits to our funding. I didn't really labor on this, but we're expecting in 2020 a $957 million loss in revenue. And the CARES Act will go a long way to help plug that. But as we move forward, I think we're looking at the whole transportation ecosystem, I think we'll be looking at it kind of more holistically, but in a different way. I think we'll be looking at creative partnership options. We've already done some of those things. For instance, some of the mobility metros that I've mentioned in our pilots up in Lake County, for example, where we actually have a partnership with businesses up there, and they're paying for a portion of that share of the cost of those services. And so we're looking to, look at, I think, other creative funding options. Could we, consider things like capturing the value of real estate development, TIF funding, all sorts of creative things, I think, going forward to potentially help support not just the transit system, but the economy as a whole. I mean, we're an underpinning, we're a core backbone part of the region's economy, but how do we think kind of collectively and holistically about all of this? I don't know if that really got to the question.
Well, it does lead into the next question, and I know we're running close on time. We may go over a few minutes just because there is just such an influx of questions and audience interest. So moving on to the next question, Illinois law requires transit agencies to achieve a 50% fare box recovery ratio. That seems impossible under the current circumstances. Has there been any discussions on the legislative level about repealing or amending this requirement?
Short answer, yes.
Okay.
A lot of conversation. So in the short term, I think the sort of the fix or the way through some of this is the flexibility that the federal government is giving us with these revenues through the CARES Act program. We are able to allocate those dollars as, you know, those losses of additional revenue. So we can count them towards the fare box recovery ratio and meeting sort of that mandate for this year. But on a parallel path, we are having conversations with legislative leaders about sort of the longer term impact of this requirement. You know, but I mean, when we say that too, that's sort of in a relief sense, but I think it's important, and the chairman touched on this, that the way the transit system is kind of funded is almost like a compact. It's funded through, you know, the taxpayers paying a portion of their share, but the riders having to kick in sort of their share. And so in the long term, I think these are some of the bigger policy questions we have to talk about, but it is certainly on the radar.
Several audience members have sent in the question, are there any planned cuts to current RTA programs?
At this point, there are no plans to cut any service or operations. You know, obviously there's some temporary adjustments, and the hope is that we will work as the economy opens up and people start moving back to work. We will work to increase service. CTA is still operating at full service. But you know, these are conversations that will happen into 2021. At this point, there are no plans. But again, sort of the paradox of the public transportation thing, and in many sort of public use spaces, it's sort of this paradox where we have to try to accommodate social distancing. So you need to actually provide a lot of service to be able to provide some of that spacing for people. So these are, again, some of the policy issues that we'll have to talk through as we really get into the 2021 process, budget planning process in earnest.
Are there plans to purchase new Metro passenger cars in the capital budget?
Yeah, the current capital program actually has planned purchases of both Metro rail cars and Metro locomotives in actually the earlier phases of the current capital program. So as the chairman mentioned, about half of the program is already sort of moving forward on some of the bond money that the state has already issued. So they will be some of the sort of the leading projects that we will be moving forward on.
Given that Metra and PACE serve parts of Wisconsin and Indiana, which you know are part of the footprint for the Alliance for Regional Development, and they're reopening at different timetables, what impact, if any, does RTA expect it to have on its operations and revenue?
Well, in terms of revenue, it won't really have any, because we don't, unless people are coming to spend their money, and we'll happily take it in sort of the Illinois 6-county region. Look, there's still sufficient, especially, I mean, Metro is probably the most impacted, especially when you're talking about sort of the exterior and sort of beyond the collar counties. Metro is still providing a significant amount of service, even with some of their reductions to accommodate, you know, ridership, some ridership return. And one point I didn't touch on to our partners in Wisconsin and Indiana, as the CARES Act, because we are part of a larger metropolitan area, our allocation, I just touched on the allocations we gave to CTA, Metro and PACE, but we did also have to allocate a portion off the top of the monies that came to our region to Wisconsin, to Southeast Wisconsin and Northwest Indiana. So they got a portion of those dollars as well to help them support some of the transit services they provide as well.
Well, and speaking of revenue, one of the questions reads, at the moment, CTA and PACE buses are free in order to protect drivers, and Metra is de facto free due to conductors staying in one car in each transit. Do RTA and its boards have any plans about how it's going to handle fare collection at some stay-at-home restrictions relax?
So first of all, I'll just clarify, they're not formally operating free. They are still asking people to pay their fares, sort of, and CTA, most of their buses, they have already installed rear door readers on their vehicles. So yes, they are not really strictly enforcing it. Metra is encouraging people to pay by app. Metra will actually also be announcing a more comprehensive program for app deployment and use across their system going forward. So all of them are still kind of expecting people to pay their fare, hoping to collect as much fare revenue as possible. It's a conversation that we're continuously talking about. The chairman touched on that I'm also working on a recovery in the national conversation. This is an issue for transit worldwide, actually. And so I'm staying plugged into, especially as other people are opening up, and how are they dealing with some of these things? How can we go to more a contactless payment, further contactless payment, certainly cashless payments, and Metra especially is one of those agencies that is actually reviewing some of their capital potential program investments, and how can they sort of quick catch up on some of those purchases and accelerate, I should say, some of the purchases they're already contemplating.
You know, I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of our questions. Maybe I can forward those on to you and you can reply, because we really do appreciate the interest that the audience has. And this is obviously so critical to getting back to some kind of new normalcy. So I'll end with this last question, and it has to do with fresh, clean air. And they said that the airlines have been addressing this concern, and what systems are now in place or are you looking at to possibly enhance the comfort that riders will have that the air is as clean as it can be, given that they are in a confined space?
You know, Kelly, as I mentioned, safety is our primary concern. I'm a rider. I ride in in a car that was delivered by Dwight Eisenhower on Metra. So I'm glad we're purchasing new cars there. The CTA is in the development stages of new cars as well, and actually have orders placed. We're looking at everything, airflow. In fact, I had this conversation with Metra the other day. So we're looking at airflow systems. We're looking at the way we clean, and we're cleaning like crazy and spending extra money on cleaning. We are also looking at everything that everyone else is doing: UV lights, sanitation sprays, how often we clean anything that anyone would touch. So we're looking at everything, but air is obviously very, very paramount here. And
Right.
that's part of the equation we're looking at.
Well, you two have been so informative, and I hope this gives comfort to our audience members and the people that are interested in getting back on public transportation and going back to work. I hope that you'll consider joining us again as things continue to change so quickly. We'd love to have you back in a few weeks to update people on where things are and what they can expect. How does that sound?
Sounds great. Thank you.
Excellent.
Remember, where transit goes, the economy grows. So we're critical to getting America back to normal here. And 50% of every new job created in the last decade in Northeastern Illinois was within a half a mile of mass transit.
It absolutely is critical to everything that we do. So thank you both for your dedication to your profession and to helping us move around and be safe. And I do look forward to continuing our conversation. To our attendees, thank you for taking the time today. I know we ran over and I apologize for that, but I will forward any questions that we were not able to get to and hope to get you an answer on those. I hope that you'll join us on Thursday at 1:30 when we learn more about lessons that can be learned from the pandemic 100 years ago. And please get involved with the Alliance and CCAC. Because of our stakeholders and our members, we're able to offer this important programming. So with that, I'm going to sign off, and I'm going to wish everybody to stay well and stay strong. We're going into a holiday weekend and a summer, and I'm hoping that really good things are in the very near future. So with that, again, Chairman, thank you so much. And Leanne,
Thank you, everybody.
Look forward to keeping in touch. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.